you ensure that all students are learning, right? So this is sort of where this comes from and how we'd like to move forward, right? The focus, obviously, student learning and student success, retention, engagement, and those areas. Always have to pitch for student learning outcomes at the college-wide level, which is the MDC 10, and you can find those on our website as well. But that your work will have some basis in these student learning outcomes, or even your program level outcomes as well, right? But this is a way for which you can talk about, or explore what you're curious about, some big ideas in higher ed, or some learning challenges and dilemmas that you've experienced throughout your teaching, career. So we obviously want you to focus on student learning, but we want to bring in what you're passionate about as well. So that's what this diagram is about. And that your project would be focused on an evidence-based approach intended on impacting student learning and success, right? So the RFP outlines student learning, engagement, and student success as what we're all aiming for. So all of our arrows are pointed in this direction, right? Student learning, success, engagement. And there are some specific priorities for the fund too. I'm sure everyone is well aware, right? So project-based learning, high impact practices, and digital learning. And then also, I know you did a lit reviews session, was the last session. So there are probably other areas, active learning strategies that people would like to foster as well. But really looking at something in a new and a different way, and then measuring that, right? What can we learn from sort of implementing these practices in our classrooms? So project design and evaluation plan. So probably most of you are at this place now where you're describing what's happening for your project, that you've picked an innovation and sort of started to think about how I would implement this innovation. And then the other key part of that is not only just the implementation or the training or the resources that you might fund with the project, but how will we know, right? So how will we know the impact, right? Was this innovation, was this practice, was this strategy worth anything? What did we learn from it? And sometimes this happens. So we can all sort of laugh at this cartoon, but in reality, we've invested a lot in our projects, right? You've done some research, you have some ideas from the lit review, and you sort of think about, well, where is my project going to go? And you have these ideas in your mind already, which is okay, right? It's okay to have these positive intentions, and we're spending time making changes, and that you think everything is going to work. But we also want a framework for evaluation, right? Like this is a key piece that needs to be built in early and then referred to often throughout your project, right? So how are you going to actually determine what success looks like? And so that's really for you as a project designer to lay out those things and then think about how will I measure, when will I measure, and what will I use in terms of my measurement, right? So we're not looking for, there are no sort of right or wrong answers here. There are some best practices that can be followed. And the important thing about this is that you actually have a plan and that you are in some way implementing that plan or capturing how the plan has sort of changed as a process of implementing, an innovative practice in a learning environment, which often happens, right? So there are a lot of frameworks for evaluation and assessment. And then for this project, we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of an evaluation and assessment, but I just wanted to offer some frameworks because I'm sure one of these will probably resonate with you in the group. So this is the college-wide assessment framework. This is what we do. At the college-wide level, the student learning outcomes have been identified. We have selected measures. We plan for data collection. We analyze the data, and we use the results. So in essence, this is really what assessment and evaluation looks like, right? And then you might have seen some other frameworks. These are all similar descriptions. Maybe the steps are collapsed, but sort of like a lot of evaluation plans refer to this as like the big three, right? Like what's going in, what are the processes that are actually happening, and then what's coming out on the other side. And we sort of live in the middle, the middle two frameworks, which is objectives, means, and measures. And this usually talks about, or this framework is usually used for people who are developing processes or new activities or new programs. Like, what are our objectives? How are we going to achieve those objectives? And then what are we going to do to measure that, right? And the one that's probably most familiar to you in higher ed is the student learning outcomes process, right? So what are our intended outcomes? How are students going to, what is going to change about their learning behaviors, their attitudes, or their cognitive skills? Those are our learning outcomes, that are intended learning outcomes. And then what teaching and learning strategies am I going to be implementing in this class, in this project, in this program to enhance student learning? And then how will I know? That's the assessment part, right? So just to say, all of these are interchangeable. Whichever one you most identify with is fine. It's just the point that you are using some framework in order to capture the work of your project, right? So that we have something to say at the end and that we are sharing this information going forward. And the driving questions for all of this work really is, how will I know the impact? And now that I know, so what, right? How am I going to share this with people in my discipline, my colleagues? How am I going to share this across the college or interdisciplinary? And, you know, we're really talking about things like quality measures. We're talking about student learning, movement in student learning. We're also talking a lot about processes as well, in terms of operations, activities, services, and things like that, right? So in terms of identifying the scope of your evaluation plan, right, your assessment might include assessing your resources, right? So the facilities, the students, and the faculty. So a point of clarification here in terms of the term, in using the term assess faculty. What we're saying here is that in your project, you are designing an intervention, a strategy, or using some innovation, but that you would assess how faculty are using that, implementing that innovation. So something like a reflective log or a journal, right? Anyone who's tried a new strategy in a classroom knows that there's a lot that goes into that in terms of like planning for it, then executing it, and then the perceived reality of, did the students learn? Was it well received? What were the glitches? So in terms of your evaluation plan, these are definitely qualitative measures, but they're important to us, right? They help us get better in the next round. It's valuable information that is lost if we don't plan to collect it in the beginning, right? So in that first bullet, or that first sub-bullet, that's what we mean when we're talking about assessing faculty, right? We're saying, what was the faculty member's experience with this innovative strategy? And then assessing the process, right? In terms of the teaching and learning process, the pedagogy, you know, the feedback for that. These are all some qualitative pieces of that, because sometimes this is the context that gets lost when we just end up with the quantitative data in the end, when we talk about retention rates or grades on assignment, things like that. So it's important to think about this and explore this avenue as well as those quantitative measures, right? So which is the next bullet, assessing your results and plans, right? And your results and outcomes. And also noting where plans have changed, right? This is valuable information as well. So we typically focus on student learning in higher ed, but we don't want you to be limited to that framework of just measuring student learning, because even though, let's say, you're using a strategy within the classroom to target a specific learning outcome and the learning hasn't moved, but students are far more engaged than they ever have been. They come to class on time, they have read the material, right? So that is also a win, right? So focusing on those byproducts of what's happening with your innovation is also useful, even if the needle on student learning isn't necessarily moving, right? And then the last category is sometimes that we focus on a processee or a product. Like, let's say we're using embedded tutors in a different way in our classrooms. So talking about or at least planning for evaluation of that process or service would be valuable as well, right? So what are the lessons learned there? How can we make this better going forward? And how could your colleague repeat it and get the same results, right? So these are the things that we're thinking about capturing in the beginning. So here is just a list of assessment methods for you to consider when you're doing your planning for your evaluation. So direct student learning measures, most people are familiar with these: objective tests, rubric scores, any sort of hard evidence of how a student demonstrates a specific student learning outcome. That's what we call a direct measure of student learning. So you can think of this as sort of like irrefutable evidence that a student can think critically, write coherently, present well, right? So those are our direct measures. Most people are familiar with them and use those often. Indirect measures are also important as well. Student perception of the learning, their self-assessments as well. This gives us valuable information. Earlier, when we talked when I showed you the evaluation plan, we talked, I don't know if I said this out loud, but that each of your projects should have at least 2 measures. So any mix of measures is fine, but that we're encouraging you to think about 2 ways in which you would collect data, right? So one might be a straight participation rate, right? Or attendance rate. Those things are totally fine in terms of a measurement, but that you would also back that up if your project goal was about improving student learning with a direct measure as well. So there isn't any recommendation on the mix of the measurements right now, but that you would think about 2 ways in which you would collect data related to your specific project, right? And in terms of categories for assessment measures, I want to talk a little bit about processes and operations, because we know.
We have a question.
Well, you have a question? Okay,
You can finish what you're saying.
Okay, all right. So about processes and operations, because like I said earlier, even if you're not focused directly on increasing student learning, that something related to student learning and success, such as engagement, might be the focus of your project, right? Or developing a new process or project, or even developing a new course, right? Which is also behind the scenes. And maybe student learning wouldn't increase on the first round of that, but the whole process of developing a new course, a new tutoring strategy, deals with processes and operations, right? So what are the satisfaction levels for students? What's the quality of that? What about productivity? Those are all dimensions for which you can measure as well, right? Again, of course, always we're looking to move the needle on student learning, but sometimes we need to focus on measuring those sort of mitigating factors that happen before we really move the needle on student learning. Curriculum is another piece. In terms of course, if you're doing a course redesign and things like that, we can talk about course curriculum mapping as a measure of assessment as well. So I'll pause for a question.
We have a question about the direct measure.
Yes.
Do you think before and after measures are necessary for these direct measures?
Oh, that is a great question. So we're talking about pre and post assessment, and that model of assessment is called value added. It is not necessary, right? So you can do a value added measure. It does tell you some things about what's happening in terms of student learning, but it is not necessary. You don't always need the baseline to say that students have achieved, right? So if we know we want students to write coherently, and we've got a rubric for which we're scoring that, and we have data in the end, and we've gone through some sort of activities to make sure that our measure is valid and reliable, we can take that end result data, right? And think about, well, where are students at the end of this project? And that's okay. We don't necessarily need the baseline data. And I think this is something that I don't know where exactly this comes from, but a lot of people rely on this heavily, and they think that it's sort of the only way in which our assessment is valid if we have a pre and post. So it's not necessary, but there are other parameters for which you do need to follow in order for us to make meaning of your data, or for you to make meaning of your data.
As a follow-up, this is my own question.
Yeah.
Another common model that faculty or anybody doing research falls to is the control group experimental group.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that model.
Okay, so this is educational research. This is action-based research, and there are very few cases in which we can do a true experimental design, right? At best, our research is quasi-experimental, and at most, it's this, it is inside this action research framework, which means that I am doing some intervention, and at the same time, I'm simultaneously measuring it, right? So, and this is where we live, because for many reasons, right? Like that, if there was something that we thought had the ability to impact student learning, we would never want to withhold it from one group, right? So that's one reason, sort of ethically, why we don't do a controlled research design, right? Because it doesn't really give us any additional benefits except withholding from one group, right? And also this idea of withholding from one group, learning is not linear, and there are many variables that go into how students learn, that even if we tried to do a controlled experiment, it wouldn't be that successful, because there's too many mitigating and intermediate factors that contribute to student learning. So it's not worth our effort, and that we should stick with the action research and the educational research model. And that's good. That's good for us, right?
Thank you.
Any other questions?
No.
Okay.
But she did say that your explanation was excellent.
Oh, good. Okay. So I just wanted to go a little bit more into the student learning assessment part of this, right? So we're not precluding anyone from doing some processes or programmatic changes in terms of their project. But if your project goal is to improve student learning assessment sort of exists on a continuum. And we have from the left to the right informal checks all the way to performance-based assessments. And sort of this continuum talks about like sort of the threshold of evidence to say that a student really has a skill, a behavior, or a thought pattern, right? So with performance tasks being that highest sort of gold standard of evaluation of a student's ability, right? And usually there's associated rubrics for the performance task, and informal checks might be something like a 1-minute paper or an exit interview, something from Angelo and Cross's CATS book, right? And then additionally, you have other sort of categories in the middle as well. So I have another slide that just gives you a little bit more breadth in terms of what these might look like in terms of the products for each of these, and they fall into the category of selected responses and constructed responses for student learning. And this has to do with, you can lay these up against Bloom's taxonomy and say that, okay, when we're asking students to do a kind of work product that's related to selecting a response, that this is recall recognition, right? So these are the first levels of learning here. And then as we move to constructed responses, we're activating student application and sort of what their skill set is in a different way, right? Because in some of these cases, students are asked to create something that wasn't there before, right? So they're manipulating the knowledge, and providing us evidence about it. So this is just some examples of things that you might consider when you're collecting information about student learning, and just wanted to share those with you. So I know we're getting close to time, but I just wanted to go over some quick hints for selecting your measures, and then of course these slides will be available online after this session as well. So really the assessment results should be useful for you for improving, right? They should be easily interpreted and unambiguous. So This means that you have a plan up front about what data you're going to collect and how you might anticipate using that data in the future, right? Some mistakes researchers make in this is they say, I'm just going to collect data from everywhere and then I'm going to figure out what it means later. So, it's a hard thing to do that, right? And it doesn't usually yield fruitful results, right? And also that I know data collection is not everyone's favorite thing like it is mine, and we see this as an onerous task. But you should look for those easy points for which you're already sort of passively collecting data, and maybe you have to do a few tweaks in order to refine that process. So in some cases, you might not need to reinvent everything you're doing in your classroom in order to get the data. So we want to encourage you to do what's easy and available. And also this information should be directly controlled by you, right? So you're doing innovation in your classroom or related to a specific program, and we're not collecting data that I don't have any impact on, right? Like student transfer rates. So that I don't have any control over, but I can control what happens in my classroom and maybe the extent to which students learn, right? So your methodologies, we're wanting to look at strengths and weaknesses, and not just what happened poorly, and then what our successes were. And also build on the data collection methods that you're already using currently. So identify 2 measures. They can be quantitative, they can be qualitative, they can be direct, and they can be indirect. There aren't any restrictions on the 2, but think about these sort of categories of data that you should be doing. Just a quick note about surveys. If you're planning to do a survey, please survey all stakeholders that you're engaging with as part of this project, and then later you can disaggregate the data, right? So you can put a demographic question. If your project, let's say, is focusing on a special population of students, like vets, and you just have a demographic question for students to self-identify, and then you can disaggregate your data later. Don't just give the survey to the students who are vets. In that way, we lose valuable information, and you don't want to set yourself up for that kind of framework. Challenges and pitfalls. So just a word of advice. We're not one size fits all. So what works for your project might not work for someone else's, and that's okay. And that we're not looking for the perfect assessment. Assessment in this way is never going to be perfect. It's always messy, and each approach that you might take will have advantages and disadvantages, and that's okay. But the important thing is that you're going in with an assessment plan, and that you're attempting to implement it and collect data, and then look at that data to see about your sort of strengths and weaknesses. Another common pitfall is that assessment, some people they do one assessment and it's at the end of the project, and then that only gives you one data point, and also it's sort of like getting to retirement and checking your retirement account the day before you retire, right? By then it's too late. So what we recommend is that you take a continuous improvement approach, that you're frequently checking in on this project, whether it be through keeping a log or journaling, or informal checks with the students in terms of student learning, that you assess early and often. And that also there's sometimes misalignment can be another feature, another challenge. And this is, the answer for this is sort of that you would clearly define your goals up front. So very clearly identify your intention and then select your assessment method, instead of selecting your assessment method first and then trying to make your goal fit later. And of course, our most common pitfall, I don't have time. And this is a reality for us, but in fact, it does hurt us. So you should take the time to pause and think about your assessment plan and how you're going to implement and collect data in the beginning, and then reflect on it often throughout your project. So what, right? We've asked you to sort of outline an evaluation plan and collect data and reflect on that data. but what does it really mean inside the context of MDC, right? So that these findings should not just be for one class and for one faculty members, but that we should find a way to share this at department meetings and to discuss what's happening and what we're learning, right? And that there would be a path for scale and replication and sustainability throughout the college, right? So that this isn't only a kind of methodology that can work in one campus at one time for one faculty member. And then also capturing your lessons learned and sharing those widely as well. So this is sort of like planting the seeds for innovation and then figuring out, okay, how can we use what was successful from this project to help students succeed and learn better in the future, right? I think we have a few minutes for questions.
We do. We have a few minutes now, so I want to give everybody a chance to put their questions into the chat box. It's a lot.
It is a lot.
And if you just want to go back to a slide, perhaps, and ask Barika to paraphrase, clarify something that she said earlier, that's a good use of these last few minutes as well. Okay, we have a question coming in. It says, when you say lessons learned, does that apply to the proposal or to the final project once it is funded?
Yes, to the final project once it's funded. So once you've implemented or are in process, then we would want to know, what has changed, how's it going, what did you learn, what was unexpected, sort of thing. Some challenges with that. So that's after the project has been funded and implemented.
Got it, is the response. And I just, as somebody who's involved in the proposal process, I will say that after the entire process is over, proposals are reviewed and projects are funded, we will send out a survey probably next summer to do our own lessons learned reflection step to make sure that we've we can strengthen this process in the future. And it's just like all innovations, every iteration gets a little bit better, hopefully. And I did send a survey out after round 1, and these series of webinars is actually an addition to the round 2 based on the feedback I got from round 1 feedback survey. So we will hopefully look for ways to learn what lessons we need to know from running this RFP cycle. But what Barika's addressing is really the faculty who have a project that's funded, implement it, study it. We've got some data, whether it's numerical or logs, qualitative. Then we would like to share that. So, like as she said, people at other campuses and other disciplines can say, oh, I like that idea, we would like to do it here. We don't want to repeat any mistakes or go down the wrong pathway. The idea is that colleagues at the college and beyond could learn from your experience. Other questions or slides you'd like to go back to? It sounds like there's no questions. I will just say that if you do have a question that comes to you later, there's the Innovation Fund email address. You can put it in there. And if it's a question that I can't answer because I don't have a level of expertise that Barika does, I will forward it to her, and she can get back to you, and we can learn from her together. So the Innovation Fund website is also there. This is the site where probably you clicked on the link to come to this webinar, and it is also the site where the slide deck will go up shortly, and the recording of this webinar will go up in hopefully by Christmas. That'll be a Christmas present, because it does take some time. So on that note, Thank you for joining us for this last webinar in the series. I hope it was useful. I think it's a rich topic, and discussions can continue beyond the framework of this webinar. Have a good holiday. If I don't see folks before the holidays, I'm seeing happy holidays in the chat box, so thank you for that. And good luck with your proposals.
Yes,
We're looking
good luck.
forward to reading them. Goodbye.